Hello, in this video I'm going to start looking at the assignment 3 of the inheritance unit. So this is assignment 3 of the unit, which is inheritance and genetic engineering. So inheritance unit. And this assignment is looking at the genetic problems. Right, and don't get this word problems throw you. So problems doesn't necessarily mean like disorders. We're here talking about how kind of, different traits, different characteristics are passed from one generation to the next. So the problems is a bit like maths problems, so you're given set of information and you need to work out what the next generation's traits or characteristics are going to be. So it's sort of problems in that context. Okay, so this is going to be a kind of a little bit of introduction to start with. So the kind of the idea of the fact that people and animals and plants can pass on characteristics from one generation to the next. I mean, obviously this is nothing new. So imagine if you had a caveman and this caveman had a caveman girlfriend, and when she had a baby and this baby looked a bit like caveman next door, then he wouldn't be very happy, right? So this idea that the genes, or obviously some characteristics were passed from one generation to the next, this has been around for thousands of years, I'm sure. But what is relatively new is the discovery that there is certain rules or laws which govern how those characteristics are passed on from one to the next generation. And the person who is sort of credited with discovery of these laws or rules is this chap called Gregor Mendel. So he is Gregor Mendel. So he was around in the 19th century. So he was born in 1822 and then he died in 1884. Right, so a fair few years ago, but certainly not thousands of years ago. So we're talking about sort of reasonably recently, and I'm going to show you a picture of Mendel. You can easily find it online as well. So this is what Mendel looked like, and I usually ask my students, if they notice anything slightly unusual about this photograph. And hopefully you can straight away see that he has some kind of, relationship with religion. So you can see that kind of straight characteristic collar, which you find in priests, and more kind of obviously is this big cross, right, which he's wearing. And so this Mendel, Gregor Mendel, he was actually a monk in a monastery. So he was Augustinian monk. And this monastery was located in a city called Brno, which is nowadays found in the modern days Czech Republic. So I've got a picture of this monastery right here. Let me just rotate it. So there you go. So that's where he spent most of his life, and he kind of progressed in his career actually. So he started off as just a monk in this monastery, and then he ended up being an abbot, so like the head of this monastery. And in those days, some of you might be aware that monasteries were centers of kind of knowledge often, because monasteries would amass big libraries, and this is not something in those days which ordinary people could easily, buy or collect a lot of books because they were expensive. But monasteries certainly did have libraries, and also, monasteries had another kind of thing going, which is characteristic to them, where they would grow a lot of their own produce. And so Mendel was also interested in gardening and kind of looking after plants. And as a kind of one of his interests, he was also interested in looking at how those plants would pass on their characteristics from one generation to the next. So one of the plants he was particularly keen on was sweet peas. So some of you might have some of those plants in your own gardens as well. And the two most common varieties in Mendel's times were white-flowered sweet peas and the purple-flowered ones. So they are not on the same plant, by the way. They're just sort of in a bouquet, but they came originally from two different plants. So these are the plants he was sort of, looking at and cross-pollinating to see what's going to happen. So let's have a look at some of his kind of experiments which he carried out in this monastery. So what he took were two parent plants. Let me just write it down, parent plants. So he used as his male plant equivalent, you remember maybe some of you don't actually know that, but this symbol stands for a male. And so he picked up purple flowering plant and decided to use it as a male, meaning that he took pollen from this plant. So pollen in plants is like a sperm equivalent, if you like, and he crossed it with a female plant, so that would be like a recipient of that pollen, and that plant was white-flowered plant. And what you need to be aware of, that these two plants, they were so-called pure-bred. So what that means is that if you took purple plant and crossed it with another purple plant, it would consistently give you purple flowers as a result. And the same was the case with the white one. So if white was crossed with another white, you would get consistently white flowers. So it's a bit like, crossing Dalmatian with another Dalmatian, you would consistently get Dalmatian puppies, right? So that's why you would look at the puppy and say, well, this is purebred puppy, right? So those plants were a bit like that, right? So he took those two different purebred plants and crossed them. So took pollen, as I said, from the purple plant, transferred it onto the white plant to see what is going to happen, right? So these are parent plants. So what's going to happen in this first generation, right? First generation. So these are going to be like the offsprings, the little kids, seedlings from this cross. So first generation in genetics is denoted as F1. So this is another kind of useful symbol to know. So what I usually ask my students is to give me some hypothesis about what's going to happen, right? So let's imagine if you didn't know any better and you were in Mendel's shoes, so you went into your garden and took these two plants, cross-pollinated them, and then kind of sat and waited and thought, well, what am I thinking about what's going to happen? So you can actually pause this video and sort of scratch your head and think about that and see what sort of hypothesis you can potentially come up with, right? Well, if you paused it and came back with your own list, I think your list might look something like that. So maybe, and this is a kind of list which I imagine Mendel had in his head as well at the time. So you could say, well, maybe you would have purple, right? All purple plants. Or maybe they're going to be all white, right? Or maybe it's going to be a bit of a mix, right? So maybe a mix of purple and white, right? Or maybe, and that's what some people think, well, if I take like purple paint and white paint and mix them together, maybe it's going to be something like pink, right? So pink or sort of lilac-y kind of color, or lilac, right? So these are some of the ideas you might have, and also I imagine Mendel had, right? So because he was sort of working from the point of common sense. But when he actually did this cross and waited for the seeds to appear and planted them again, what he found out was that the actual result of this cross was that all F1 plants were purple. So all purple. Right? And I put exclamation mark because I think he must have found it a little bit surprising, right? I'm sure, because, if you take two completely different colors, mix them together, and then as a result for some reason you just came up with one of them colors, not combination of the two, not pink or lilac or mix of the two. So he found that, I'm sure, a little bit surprising. He repeated this experiment a few times just to make sure that he didn't go wrong somewhere, and he still came up with exact same result time after time. So all first generation plants were still purple. So he I imagine scratched his head at this point and thought, well, what's next? What's the next step? Well, the next step he decided, how about if we kind of swap those around? What if we use kind of white plant as my male equivalent, the one which is going to give me the pollen? So let's try this. So what? And if I cross it with the recipient of the pollen, which is going to be purple. So these are still going to be parent plant, right? So parent plants. Okay? And the reason why he did that, I imagine, was because he thought, well, maybe these plants are all purple because that was the male plant, right? So male, particularly in those times, was seen as this kind of stronger sex, the one which is going to overpower the female. And so how about if I swap it, maybe all of them are going to be white, right? And what he found out, that my first generation of that cross, so F1 of that cross, is still had all purple flowers. So that didn't seem to change anything. So swapping those around as my male and female equivalents, it didn't really change things at all. So then, well, okay, so I tried that. I tried this other type of cross. What's next, right? And again, you kind of can put yourself into Mendel's shoes and think, well, what would I have done? And I'm sure quite a few people would have just, shrugged their shoulders and said, well, beats me. I don't know what's next. Might as well go and do something else, do a bit of more gardening, or go and sit down in the shade and have a beer and be done with it, right? But that's where kind of his genius came through, because he didn't just give up and shrugged his shoulders and said, beats me, but he decided to take it a bit further. So what he did next was he decided, well, what would happen if I take that first generation of plants and cross it with another first generation plant, okay? So let's try that. So it's going to be F1, right, which is still purple, right, cross with another first generation purple plant, right? And so in this case, it doesn't really matter which one is male, which one is female, but if we sort of just nominate at least one of them as a male, another one as a female, just for consistency's sake, let's do that. So now we've got two first generation plants, two purple plants crossed together, and we're now going to have a look at what's going to happen in the second generation. Now, second generation is not actually S1 or anything like that, just in case you're wondering. It's actually F2, right? So you're still carrying on with F symbol, but it's, instead of 1, it's going to be 2. So F2. So again, if you wanted to come up with a few hypotheses about what's going to happen in this case, you might also think, well, maybe they're all going to be purple again, or maybe we're going to have a mix, or maybe it's somehow going to switch to this pink color. So what Mendel actually found was that they were no longer just all purple. Actually, he had a mix of some plants which were purple and some which were white, okay? So he did have a mix. So it wasn't, a plant which have both type of flowers, but it had certain number of plants, right? Certain number of seeds which produced purple flowers and certain number of seeds which produced white flowers. And when he counted these plants, he actually found that there was a particular spread, particular number of purples per certain number of whites. And that kind of number came up ultimately to a ratio of 3 purple plants per each 1 white plant. Okay, so there was a particular ratio which was attached to those numbers. And again, he did lots of the same experiment just to make sure, so he didn't just do one and thought, well, that's kind of 3 to 1, that's that. No. He did like literally hundreds of these experiments, so that he was running into thousands of plants just to check that this ratio worked time after time after time. And that's exactly what he found, that there was this particular ratio of plants. And what he also kind of thought is, again, he took it a little bit further, because he thought to himself, well, what does that actually mean? What does that mean? And what it means is that if my first generation plant were all purple, that meant that somehow inside those plants, those F1 plants, the information about white was somewhere hidden, right? Because if I had nowhere to hide this information about white, it wouldn't have appeared in the second generation. And that gave him an idea that the color of those flowers was somehow recorded or stored inside these plants, not in a single place, but in 2 different places, right? Because otherwise, if you didn't have this kind of second secret compartment, if you like, where I could store information about the white color, it wouldn't have come up again, right? So that was his kind of line of thinking. And don't forget, he was living in the middle of 19th century, so he had no information about DNA or chromosomes or even cells, were very described in a very basic way. So he couldn't operate with the terminology we are all familiar now, because it hadn't been discovered at that point. But what he found when he was talking about these 2 places where information was stored, what he was actually referring to was homologous chromosomes. So let me just remind you about those. So you remember, you've got in your body, in your cells, you have chromosomes which come in pairs, right? So those pairs, they are known as homologous chromosomes. Right? So what actually, Mendel discovered, without sort of fully understanding, obviously, this concept, because he didn't know anything about chromosomes. But what he essentially discovered is that each characteristic or each trait is recorded in pairs of homologous chromosomes. So it's not just in one place you have a record about, say, color of flowers, right? But in 2 places. So let's say if in this homologous chromosome this information is located here, right, about the flower color, then in the equivalent location in your second homologous chromosome, you also have information about the color of those plants. So in plants, the chromosomes also going to be found, and they're going to be very similar shape and everything as you would find in human cells. That's why I've drawn them like that. So this is going to be a chromosome from the mother of that plant, and in the second location that will be information from the mother. So this is mom, this is still dad, right? And this information is both about the color, say, color. Okay, so that's what Mendel meant about those 2 places or 2 locations where information is stored. So it's actually information stored in a pair of homologous chromosomes, right? So now let's throw in some terminology, right, and start kind of writing the same problems, but using kind of the method and the approach of modern genetics. So the first thing which I need to introduce is this kind of terminology of the dominant and the recessive gene. So if we look at our color, purple and white, you can probably guess that the dominant color in this particular case is going to be purple. All right? So purple is our dominant trait. And the white, the one which was kind of overshadowed, if you like, by the purple, is called recessive trait. Okay, and those traits are being coded by genes, right? And in genetics, we use capital and lowercase letters to denote dominant and recessive. Now, you can pick any letter pretty much. If you have a question which specifies which letter you need to pick, then stick with that letter. If it doesn't specify, you can choose your own letter. And my only advice would be to choose a letter where kind of capital and lowercase are different, so it's easy to tell them apart. So let's say I'm going to use capital A for my purple color, dominant trait, and the lowercase little a for the white. Okay? So so my next thing is, so going back to kind of this idea of two homologous chromosomes. So I've got two genes, at least, right, which record that particular trait. So my purebred purple plant would actually have two genes, which is one big A, right, which is found on this chromosome, and the second big A, which is found in the second homologous chromosome. So my purebred parent plant would have two big A's inside those chromosomes. And that combination of letters is known as genotype. So genotype is like a combination of symbols or letters which denotes which particular genes are found inside the two homologous chromosomes. So let me write it down. So genotype is a combination of letters or symbols that denote genes found in an organism. Right, and that genotype, that combination of genes gave that plant purple flowers, right? So purple flowers. So that information is known as phenotype. Phenotype, right? So genotype is my combination of letters. Phenotype is like a description of what that organism actually looks like or what kind of trait it has. So this is like just a word description. So this is a word description of a trait or characteristic. Okay, so letters, genotype, the description is phenotype. So try to kind of remember those two words. Okay, so let me go into the next page, next slide. So I had my two big A's. That was my genotype, which gave me purple flowers, right? Then you also might have genotype where you have two genes which are coding for the white flowers, right? So there is different genotype, and this would result in white flowers. And finally, you also might have combination of genes where in one pair of homologous chromosomes you have purple gene, but in the second chromosome out of that pair you have little a, right? The recessive gene. So your genotype would be capital A, little a, and overall that would give you still purple color because the big A, that dominant gene, is going to overpower the little a, right? So let me draw like an arrow, right? So just it's sort of suppressing, overpowering that gene. So the overall outcome is purple flowers. So a bit more terminology, I'm afraid, at this point. So two capital A's, that kind of genotype is known as homozygous dominant. So this is homozygous dominant genotype. So homo, that bit means same. Okay, think about like homosexual couple, right? So said two people of same sex, as a partnership, as a couple. So homozygous, in this case, you have two of the same genes, and both of them are dominant. So I'm hoping you can kind of figure out what this genotype is going to be called. So this is still homozygous because the two genes are the same, so homozygous. But this is homozygous recessive genotype. And then the final one, what do you think this one is called? Come on, clever people. Right, so these two are homozygous, so now you have got two different symbols, two different genes in the same organism. So this is going to be heterozygous, right, like heterosexual couple, two people of different sex living together. So heterozygous. So I can't use either dominant or recessive, just heterozygous, right? Meaning that two genes are different. So you just need to be aware of that terminology, understand what that terminology means. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do the same two experiments which Mendel did, but this time I'm going to write them out in the way which modern geneticists would have written them down. And that's how you are going to kind of present also your work for the assignment. So let's start with my first problem. So you remember I had parent plants, where I had purple as a male plant, and I was crossing it with a female white. Now, let's think together. So that bit of information about purple and white, is this phenotype or is this genotype? So if you can't quite remember, just go back and look at this video again, or if you're writing notes, just go back to your notes. So you should know that is essentially description, right, of what these plants look like, yeah? And so that makes it phenotype. So these are your phenotypes. So next, I need to work out genotypes of these plants. So what are my genotypes going to be? So you remember I need to be using two letters in the genotype, not one letter, two letters, because the information is recorded in two homologous chromosomes, and so it's sort of you have this two copies of each gene at the very least. So I'm going to be using, you remember, capital A for purple. So I know that this is purebred plant, so it's going to be two big A's. And my white plant, that was also purebred, so this is going to be two little a's, right? So they're kind of unpolluted, pure genes, so they're both homozygous plants. So next step, I need to work out gametes that these plants can produce, okay? Gametes means the same as sex cells, right? So my male plant is able to produce sex cells, which is big A, or it can produce another sex cell, which is also big A. So all I've done really is taken those two letters from the genotype and separated them out into two categories. Why is it important to use semicolon? Because I want to show that these are two different sex cells. How did this come about? Well, let's think about what's going to happen when any organism is going to produce sex cells. So let's say humans with sperm and egg, right? So when you've got your cell originally, during meiosis, because that's where the process which produces sex cells or gametes, you're going to kind of halve the amount of genetic information, right? So whatever genes you had in the original cell, they're going to be halved and separated out into separate sex cells. And that's exactly what I'm doing here. So instead of two letters, each of my sex cells is going to just end up with a single letter, single gene inside them. So following the same logic in the female plant, you're going to have one little a as one possible sex cell, and another little a as another possible sex cell. Next step. So next step is called Punnett square. So Punnett is written with a capital P. I hope you will realize why, because this is named after a person, so nothing to do with punnets of strawberries. And this chap Punnett kind of came up with easy way of making sure you have like a straightforward way of identifying